She loved to crochet and often turned to her mother, who was an expert, for help. So how did it go with your grandfather today? She asked. That went well, I said. I'll probably come by tomorrow afternoon when I'm done. Okay, she said. Don't forget we have a date tomorrow night. How could I forget something like that? I asked. To this she giggled. By the way, my mom said to say hi to you, she said. I heard her mom in the background yell out, Hi, Trey. I laughed. Say hi to your mom, I said to Karen. I heard her turn to her mother. Trey said to tell you hi, Mom, she said, and turned to the phone again. By the way, Trey Harrison, she began. I love you. I know I don't tell you this as often as I should, but I love you. I love you too, Karen, I said. Karen had been hurt a lot in the past, and she wasn't the type to express love on short notice. I felt truly blessed that she felt as if she could say that to me, and in fact I really did love her. I'll see you tomorrow night, okay? She asked. I'll see you then, I said. We said goodbye and ended the conversation. The next day I finished work earlier than I had anticipated. I checked my schedule for the next week, sent in my timesheets to get my paycheck, and went to see Paps. I wanted to hear the rest of his story. When I arrived at the nursing home, I said hello to Julie, who smiled as I checked in, and then went to his room. I gave him a proper hug and poured them each a cup of coffee, placing his cup in a coaster. So how are you doing with that redhead? He asked. What's her name? Karen. Yes, Dad, this is Karen, and things are going really well between us, I said. Are you thinking about marrying her? My dad asked. I nodded my head. I think so, Pops, I said. He nodded his head and smiled. You know, I wouldn't mind if you wanted to move it to the old place, he said with a wink. You mean living in sin? I asked sarcastically, feigning shock. He laughed. I may be old, but I'm not stupid, he said. She's a good influence on you, son. And I know your grandmother would approve too. Thanks, Dad, I said. I just wish Mom and Dad were still here. He smiled and patted my knee. I know, son, he said. I do too. But it's time for you to look to the future, and I think Karen should be a part of that future. But that's not why you're here, is it? I smiled. He leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. Let me see, where was I just now? You just pulled up in front of your house and saw a strange car out front, I said. Having read several stories on the internet, I was well aware of the ordinariness of the strange car outside the house, as many authors had included it in their stories. Oh yeah, he said. He gave me a moment to start recording before continuing. I parked the car and took a deep breath before entering the house. What will I find there? I thought to myself. Will she be in his arms? Would they have sex in my bed? I worked up the courage to get out of the car. I entered the house not knowing what I would find there. When I went inside, I saw a tall, well-built man in a dark suit sitting on a couch. He stood up when I came inside. Doris was in the kitchen making dinner. She came out when she heard the door open, and I saw her wiping her hands on the apron she wore over her house dress. Grove, you're back early, she said. I was just starting dinner. Please meet my cousin Michael J. Smith, from Ardmore, Oklahoma. Mike, this is my husband, Grove. The man held out his hand and I reluctantly shook it. I noticed the lipstick residue on his lips, and noticed the small scar across his right cheek. Nice to finally meet you, he said in flawless English. I thought that being from Oklahoma, he might have a slight Western accent, but that was not the case. That struck me as rather odd. But then again, I didn't meet people from Oklahoma that often. Nice to meet you, Mike, I said. Please have a seat. I'm just going to get rid of this uniform if you don't mind. Not at all, he said with a smile. Something about that smile made me wary. Don't ask me what it was, but I felt uneasy. I opened the door to my office and put my briefcase on the floor, double-checking to make sure it was locked. I closed and locked the door, and then went to my bedroom to change. I listened to see if I could hear what they were saying, but I didn't. I looked around but saw no sign that they were doing anything here. I changed into my uniform and went back to the front room. I poured myself a drink and noticed that Mike had already helped himself. I hope you don't mind, he said. Doris said I should help myself. Since you are her cousin, I see no need to state otherwise, I said. What's the saying? Mi casa es su casa. Mike looked confused for a moment before responding. Hadn't he heard that before? Well, thank you, he finally said. We sat in the front room, and Doris stayed in the kitchen. So what do you do, Mike? I asked. And what brings you to Las Vegas? Well, I'm a salesman, he said. I spend a lot of time on the road, and I was just passing through here on my way to Reno. I'm sure it's not as interesting as what you do, he added, trying to encourage me to brag about my job. Oh, I don't know, I said. You travel a lot. You see new things all the time. And I'm stuck in the same old pile of dirt every day. So what are you selling? Mostly building materials, he said. Nothing retail. Everything for contractors. You'd be surprised how much was built after the war. I noticed the scar, I said. Were you in the war? Yes, he said. I got it from a Kraut bullet. Were you in the war? Yes, I told him. I spent time in the Pacific Theater. I'm sure I didn't see as much combat as you did in Europe. We all did our part, he said. Doris came out and called us to the table. We sat and ate, and I think I studied them, almost as much as they studied me. I couldn't help but wonder if they were really cousins, or if it was just a story they told me to throw me off. When we finished, Mike stood up and kissed Doris on the cheek. I noticed the way she looked at him. Something about it didn't feel right. It was delightful, he said. We'll definitely do it again. He turned to me and held out his hand, which I accepted. I should be going now. Thank you for letting me share dinner with you, Grove. It was a pleasure to meet you. Likewise, I said. After he left, I helped Doris clear the table, and then, after pouring each of us a drink, I sat down in the front room. Nice guy, your cousin, I said as she sat down. Yes, thank you, she said. You two seemed very close, I said. We've always been close, she told me. You bet we have, I thought. I haven't seen him since he went off to war. I said. She looked at me strangely for a minute. You seem preoccupied with something, she said. Is everything okay? Sure, I said. Just thinking about something that came up recently. But I'll deal with it. She smiled and hooked me as if nothing had happened. For the next few days I was on alert, waiting to see what James would find out. Of course I gave him all the information about Mike's description and the car he drove, as well as the California license plates. He nodded his head in thanks when I was done. Thank you, Captain Harrison, he said. That's very helpful. A few days later I called James to see if he had any information for me. As a matter of fact, yes, Captain, he said. Would you mind stopping by on your way home from work today? I'll be there, I said. I got out a little early and went into his office. His secretary ushered me inside right away. Good to see you, Captain, he said, lighting a cigarette. So what did you find out? I asked anxiously. A few things, he said. First, my colleague in Hawaii checked the paperwork. Did you see the judge who married you sign the marriage license? No, I said. When I looked at it, it was signed. He said he'd file it for me. Turns out there was no marriage certificate, James said. Never. In fact, the judge who supposedly married you was found dead of a gunshot wound a few days after your wedding. The truth is, according to the authorities, you were never married. What? I asked. That's not all, he said. The woman you know as Doris Hastings is actually Russian. Really? I asked. Are you sure? Absolutely, he said. I thought I recognized her face from the photograph you gave me. Her real name is Svetlana Fedorova, and she's a KGB agent. The last time I saw her was in Bavaria at the end of the war. I thought she'd been killed, but apparently not. The man you know as Michael Smith is actually Michel Schmidt, a former member of the Waffen SS. There was talk in intelligence that he was recruited by Fedorova, as a double agent and moved to the Soviet Union after the war. Wow, I said. Maybe we'd better call the FBI or someone. Generally speaking, I would agree, James said. But I'm afraid it could get you into a lot of trouble. Being duped by a Soviet spy won't reflect too well on your record. It could also cost you your security clearance and possibly your job. But I had no idea she was Russian, I said. Never mind, James said. I suspect they've chosen you for something. What exactly I don't know. But I do know that they plan to kill you when they're done. I can also tell you that they've been quite active. He pulled out some black and white photos of the two of them, naked in a motel room. Where did you get them from? I asked. It's better you don't know, James said. But that's the least of your worries. Since your marriage isn't officially registered, there's no way you can divorce her. So what do we do? I asked. I have an idea that will take care of everything, he said with a sly smile. We talked and made plans for the next hour or so. Daddy stopped talking and looked up at me before he spoke. I saw a tinge of guilt and shame on his face. I stopped the tape. Everything all right, Pops? I asked. This next part is the hardest part in this whole story, he said. I hope you won't think badly of me after this. Dad, there's nothing you can say to change the way I feel about you, I said. He nodded his head. I hope you are, son, he said. I want you to know I'm not proud of what I did. It's okay, Pops, I said. All right, son. Here we go, he said. I started the tape again and waited for him to finish. I waited for the day of the next challenge, just as James and I had planned. He looked after Doris, Svetlana, and Mike and knew their routines well. Apparently Mike had a motel room and Doris went to see him almost every day. I called James and he informed me that the two of them were in a motel room and would probably be there for a few hours. It was not unusual for me to come home in a government truck. I used it a lot in my job when preparing test sites. You see, part of my job was to make sure everything was ready for each test. That meant I was the last one on the pad before detonation. When James told me where they were, I made sure I had the gear we had discussed earlier. I headed to the motel and met up with James. Luckily, their room was on the second floor and in the back of the motel. No one would see us enter or leave the room, he said. As we had planned, I wore green coveralls and a cap, so no one would recognize me as an army officer. Shua, James said as I climbed out of the car. They're asleep right now. Get everything ready while I put them down. I nodded my head and quietly opened the back door of the truck. I pulled out the ramp and attached it to the back of the truck, and then opened the metal crate that was already standing inside. When I turned around, James was holding Doris Svetlana in a burlap sack over his shoulder. He tossed her into the crate. Is that her? I began. He shook his head. No, but she'll be gone for a few hours, he said. I'll be right back. A few minutes later, he returned with Mike and put his body in the box next to hers. Then he gathered up all the things that were in the room and put them in the box. I watched as he cuffed their hands behind their backs, making sure the chains were intertwined. He also stuffed their underwear in their mouths. I closed the box and locked it shut. They were so tightly crammed in that there was no way to move, much less escape. Finished with my work, I looked at my watch. Do you have time to get back before the exam? He asked. I nodded my head. Oh yes, I said. Let me know how it went, he said. I thanked him and left while he wiped down everything he touched. I arrived at the test site just in time to be escorted out by the military police. I thought you weren't going to make it, Cap, one of the guards said. Just wanted to grab a bite to eat before the test, I said. They quickly peered into the back of my truck and waved me over. Take care, Cap, the guard said and saluted. I saluted him back and headed inside. I made my way to the tent where the weapons were being prepared for testing. After finishing my part of the job, I sent everyone else on their way as usual. Fortunately, I was able to park my truck, so that my movements would not be visible from the camera set up a few miles away. After making sure everyone else was gone, I drove the truck up to the tent, opened it, then lowered the ramp and took the dolly. It took some fiddling, but I managed to center the crate on the dolly. It wasn't easy, let me tell you. Doris Svetlana didn't weigh that much, but Mike weighed as much as I did, if not more. I finally pulled out the box under the scaffolding that held the weapon, and noticed that there was a metal plate running along the scaffolding underneath the bomb, probably to support the structure. At least it was hiding what was under the weapon, which was all I cared about. I unlocked the crate and opened it slightly. They started to wake up and blinked their eyes a few times before they recognized me. They were both very surprised to see me when I knelt down over them. So, I said, I understand you wanted a good look at our atomic technology. Well, here you go. It's really not much more powerful than the bombs we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but it'll do. If it's any consolation, you won't feel a thing when it goes off. 1 second you'll be here and the next you'll be gone. That's it, I added, snapping my fingers. I realized that Doris Svetlana wanted to say something, so I pulled the gag out of her mouth. You imperialist pig, she hissed. I shoved Mike's underwear back into her mouth and laughed. You lying, cheating communist bitch, I said in reply. I know all about you and Comrade Schmidt. You have about 15 minutes to come to terms with what you commies worship. By the way, I want a divorce. Goodbye and enjoy hell. Her eyes widened as I slammed the drawer shut and locked it shut. I knew there was no way they could escape. After replacing the cart, I removed the tarp tent and stuffed it into another metal box, then loaded it into my truck like I always did. I took one last look around and then left the site the same way I came in, just like I always did. My hands were shaking and everything inside was shaking. When I reached the guarded observation deck, I took a few deep breaths and calmed down a little. Before I parked the truck and stepped inside, I joined the rest of the observers, grabbing my protective gear, and we took the usual precautions. Soon I heard the countdown and realized that in a few seconds all hell would break loose. And so it did. I knew that Doris Svetlana and her accomplice had already vaporized and would never be seen or heard from again. Like everyone else, I waited a bit before looking, and then I saw a mushroom cloud rising into the sky. Using binoculars, I looked at what was supposed to be ground zero. I don't know why. I knew there would be no evidence of what I had done there, yet I was compelled to look. When everything quieted down, I went through the monitoring stations like everyone else, then returned the truck and got into my car. I was still shaking when I got home. I had never done anything like that in my life, and I knew I was going to hell. It's over, I told James when I called him from home. All right, he said. Give it a day or so, then report her missing. If you need to talk, let me know. I will, I said. Thanks for everything, he laughed. Wait until you get my bill, he said. I laughed for the first time that day. Dad stopped talking and looked at me, guilt and sadness in his eyes. I stopped the tape. It's okay, Pops, I said, hugging him. You said yourself that they were planning to kill you. When they were done, not only did you save your life, but you protected the country from 2 hostile foreign agents. You have nothing to be ashamed of. He nodded his head. I've been telling myself that ever since, he said. And it still weighs on me, you know. I know, Dad, I said. But we were at war, remember? You did what you had to do. It was either you or them. And personally, I'm glad you did. Otherwise, you and I would never have met. As I looked at him, a tear appeared in his eyes and he smiled. I never thought about it, son, he said. You know, you're the bravest man I've ever met, Pops, I said. I'm proud of you. He hugged me tightly and I felt his tears soak my shirt. After a few minutes, he wiped his eyes and looked at me. The guilt and sadness was gone. Maybe telling you about it is what I've needed all these years, he said. I've been carrying it around ever since. I'm curious, I said. What happened next? I waited a couple days and then filed a missing persons report, he said. They came back a few days later and said her car was found at a motel, but they found no sign of her. They said she may have met someone and left with them. They said I'd probably never hear from her again. We both laughed. That would have been one hell of a phone call, I said, making him laugh out loud. What happened after that? A few months passed, and at James's suggestion, I went to Capshaw's, he said. James and I decided it would be best for me to act like the marriage was real, even though we knew it wasn't. Capshaw filed for divorce, citing being abandoned. I drove to Reno, and in a few minutes it was settled. On the way out of town, I stopped and threw the ring into the Truckee River, as he had suggested. For the next few years, I was halfway expecting federal agents to come to me, but they never did. In the 1960s, I retired from government service and took a job as a teacher. That's where I met Patricia. The rest is history. How did she keep in touch with her superiors? I asked. He shrugged. I don't know, he said. And I never found out. I guess it doesn't matter now, does it? I guess not, I said. Our visit was interrupted when a nurse knocked on the door. She came in and announced that it was time for dinner, and I said goodbye. Be sure to bring your charming girlfriend to us, he told me. I will, Dad, I said. Maybe tomorrow if you don't mind. I'm looking forward to it, he said. That night, Karen and I went out for dinner, drinks, and dancing. She took a few things with her, including a large paper bag, with something inside that she said was a surprise. Later, after we made love in my apartment, she turned to me. Are you okay, Trey? She asked. Yeah, why do you ask? I asked her. Well, it just seems like you're a million miles away, she said. What's on your mind? I stopped by to see Dad today, I said. He told me the rest of his story. I briefly remembered what he told me. Wow, she said. Remind me never to get on his bad side. I chuckled. We'll go see him tomorrow. Maybe after I kick your ass on the miniature golf course? Sure, if you want, I said. The next day we played a game of miniature golf, and yes, she beat me. And no, I didn't let her. She would have realized that right away. Later, we went to Daddy's house. She took her bag with her and carried it to the nursing home. His eyes lit up when he saw us coming in. Hello, young lady, he said as she hugged him tightly. I have something for you, she said, holding out a paper bag to him. He opened it and pulled out a plastic blanket container that contained an Afghan. She helped him open it and pulled out the Afghan. I just finished these the other day, she said. I know you like Afghans, so I made one for you. He smiled, holding it in his hands. It's wonderful, he said. Thank you, I really like it. He turned to look at me. Son, if you don't marry this girl, I will, he declared. You're right, Pops, I said. I took one of Karen's hands in mine and knelt down in front of her, right next to Grandpa. I looked into her eyes. Karen, I said, I love you madly, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me? She looked surprised at first, but then she smiled broadly. She put her arms around my neck and kissed my face. Oh yes, Trey, she said. I'm going to marry you. I love you so much. I love you too, I said. We heard clapping from the door. And when we turned around we saw several nurses clapping and smiling. Dad joined in too. A couple months later we were married, and the nursing home brought my grandfather to the church, so he could celebrate with us. He handed me an envelope containing first-class airfare to Las Vegas, and a reservation at the best hotel. After a few months his health deteriorated so badly that he was moved to the hospice wing of the nursing home. Karen and I spent as much time with him as we could. I could see that although his body was shutting down, his mind was still very active. I could also tell that he no longer felt any guilt for what he had done. On my last visit he was sane enough to tell me that he had made his peace with God and was ready to join his beloved Patricia. Don't cry for me, son, he said quietly. We'll be together again. I promise. I love you, son. I hugged him as he let out his last breath. I couldn't hold back. I cried. I love you too, Daddy, I said between sobs. As I looked up at his face, I saw the easy, mischievous smile I had grown to love since I was a child, and I knew he was in a better place. Karen came into the house and hugged me as we both mourned his passing. He was buried in uniform with full military honors, next to his wife Patricia. The honor guard carefully folded the flag that draped his coffin and handed it to me along with a salute. He had fought for his country and deserved all the honors due him, I thought. A few days later, I received a letter from his lawyer asking me to stop by his office. I was curious to know what he wanted, so I went. Your grandfather left you everything, the lawyer said. The house, the money, everything. All in all, it's a substantial sum, even after his last expenses. If you'd like, I can assign you a financial advisor to help you manage it. He also asked me to give you this, he added, handing me a large sealed envelope that looked rather old. It's been stored in my safe for several years now. Don't ask me what's in it because I have no idea. Your grandfather said it could only be opened after he died. Thank you, I said. And yes, I'd like to meet with your financial advisor, I added, seeing the rather substantial amount of money Dad had left behind. I didn't open the envelope until after I got home. I was shocked at what I discovered. It seemed Pops had kept everything, including a copy of a report written by James Ham, and a yellow divorce certificate, declaring him free from one Doris Harrison, née Hastings, on the grounds of abandonment. There was even a photograph of the house in which they lived. That night, Karen and I went through it all shaken. I guess everything my dad had told me was true. The last sheet turned out to be a photocopy of some old official report in Russian. It seemed to be something from a giant stash of documents issued by the old Soviet KGB. It had an English translation attached to it. As far as I could tell, it was a series of field reports by a certain Svetlana Fedorova, in which she informed her superiors in Moscow that she suspected that her target, that is, the Pope, might know her real identity. Her early reports stated only that she had become intimate with a man very familiar with American atomic weapons work. She never called Pops by name, but it was clear that she was frustrated, that she could not get anything useful out of him, and told her superiors that all he wanted to do was have sex and watch capitalist television. Later dispatches revealed even more frustration. Her superiors were telling her that she should be more aggressive in her actions. In the last dispatch, she reported that she and Michelle were planning something drastic. I'll deal with him at the first opportunity, she told her superiors. Karen and I had a good laugh about that. The KGB report said that neither Fedorova nor her German-born assistant were ever heard from again. They even speculated that the two had run off to get married, but they just couldn't be found. The operation was stamped deceased. They have no idea, I said, making Karen laugh. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.